Hey everyone, and welcome to the lecture component that's going to cover the control of our ventilation. So, just to have an overview of how this control works, ultimately, anytime we have a feedback loop or a system set up in our body, it's to maintain homeostasis. Now, homeostasis is this balance or this perfect zone where our biology works ideally. We spoke about this idea a little bit when we were speaking about enzymes and pH levels. So something too acidic would have the enzymes change shape and not be able to function anymore. So that's a good example of homeostasis. So when we're looking at ventilatory control, what we need to do is have some sort of system to ensure we have enough oxygen getting supplied to all our tissues. And we have control centers that provide feedback loops for this. But interestingly, as we'll come to find, some of the main drivers as far as what actually really controls our ventilation isn't necessarily oxygen. And that's one of the things that I think catches students maybe by surprise a little bit. So as we get into this, we'll find more about that. So for just to cover a few points here, whenever we're in homeostasis at rest, we'll note that our oxygen that we're taking into our blood, into our tissues, is matched by the carbon dioxide that leaves the body. And there's, essentially all our needs are met as far as how we just respire in those cases. There is this kind of innate monitoring of pressure of oxygen, so oxygen content, partial pressure of carbon dioxide, or the amount of carbon dioxide in our blood, as well as how much hydrogen protons are present. Another way of saying that is our pH levels, both in our blood and cerebral spinal fluid. But and so anyways, when we start to exercise, we'll notice that we're decreasing the amount of oxygen in our blood, increasing carbon dioxide. This makes sense to us so far. An increase of hydrogen or acidity levels. And again, hopefully by this point in time, knowing what you know about metabolism and metabolic substrates and byproducts, this should make sense why we have more hydrogen protons, or why our blood might become more acidic. And last but not least, all of this leads to an increase of pulmonary ventilation. Okay. So that's kind of our overview, but there's a few specifics. So we kind of divide our respiratory control into something that's more central, and then some things that are more peripheral. And so one of the key components to our more central respiratory controls is our respiratory center. So this is a region within, it's kind of like a shared region between our medulla oblongata and our pons. Now both of these are lower brain centers, and there's an image coming up that will help show you where this might be. And what these do act as like a relay center, or a central hub where we get input from throughout the body from different receptors to help figure out our respiratory rate and depth. So and one of the things that this also does is act as a pacemaker. So if you think of your SA node and AV nodes in your heart, when we went through the cardiovascular pacemakers, this is the region where we have our pacemakers for the rhythmic breathing that we have. Now, as we know, because we've done this ourselves throughout different parts of our lives, we can control the rate at which we breathe. So it's not all passive and automatic, right? If we want, we can choose to hold our breath. We can choose to inhale deeper or forcefully exhale. And so what a lot of that conscious control, not the automatic or autonomic control, comes from is our higher brain centers, like our motor neurons, and just our conscious control of breathing. But we have chemoreceptors in our medulla, so oblongata, again, something that controls the rate of depth, which I already mentioned. And there's also lots of other receptors throughout our body. We're going to cover those in detail coming up here that will help feed back information to our medulla and pons to help us control our breathing. And so here's a nice schematic, kind of sets the foreground of what we just spoke about. So here's our respiratory center in the medulla, and the pons is just this kind of region that juts out. It translates to roughly the bridge, so it kind of bridges part of our higher and central midbrain functions with our lower brain function, but it's just this section of the brainstem there. But I digress. What are these different influences? Well, as I alluded to before, we have central, and then we have more peripheral inputs or feedbacks to help our control. Okay, in and around our central, so the first of the two, our central system or feedback systems is going to be around the brain and the spinal cord, and in particular, aside from the brain structures, our cerebral spinal fluid is really important. It's kind of this fluid around the brain that kind of helps protect it. It can be found in our spinal column as well. And then we have our peripheral control centers or receptors that end up sending information regarding oxygen, carbon dioxide, and acidity from all these different places, as well as some what's called mechanoreceptors. So I'll speak first to mechanoreceptors, and then we'll get into what chemoreceptors are. So mechanoreceptors are anytime there's a physical change in tissue. So for example, if there's a stretch in the lungs, our mechanoreceptors will pick that up. Same with our joint spaces and our muscles themselves. We have sensory neurons that are called proprioceptors, and these stretch receptors that help give us feedback as far as whether we should be increasing or decreasing our respiratory rate. So again, peripheral is some of these tissues, more central is in and around the brain. Okay, so we covered mechanoreceptors. Chemoreceptors, as you say here are any receptors that respond to chemical change. So that's going to be oxygen, carbon dioxide, or pH, which is our hydrogen concentrations. When we look at our central chemoreceptors, so again, these are mechanisms that help control our respiratory rate centrally, so around the brain and spinal cord, so the medulla and our other components of our respiratory control center, we see that, sure enough, it responds in particular to hydrogen concentration. Now, that's in these central areas, but unlike our hydrogen protons, carbon dioxide readily diffuses into the central nervous system. So what ends up happening is we get this buffer system that occurs where an increase in carbon dioxide pushes our kind of, what am I trying to say here? The buffer equation. I'll explain a little bit more what that is, but it pushes this buffer equation into having a greater concentration of hydrogen protons. So again, even though we exercise and we generate hydrogen protons, which can cause acidity within the cell, we have this really great buffer system to protect our body from being overwhelmed with change in pH. So, and that's what this is, which is called bicarbonate. Okay, and so we have that quite available in our blood in particular. But again, the point that I'm trying to get to, and sorry, it's been a little muddled getting there, but I'll just re-clarify here. So one of the driving receptors that we respond to in our medulla and control center is hydrogen protons. However, the thing that forces a greater concentration of hydrogen protons because of this buffer system is carbon dioxide. So changes in the cerebral spinal fluid of hydrogen protons, so it's not the CO2, are the cause of increased ventilation. But this whole process and that whole increase of these hydrogen protons in our cerebral spinal fluid is because this buffer system is driven in this direction by carbon dioxide. Okay, so it seems like kind of splitting hairs here, but it's a really important concept to understand that what centrally, again, our brain and brainstem, which is the primary drivers of our ventilatory response, and where that's coming from. So what you might notice from all of this is we haven't mentioned oxygen once. So nowhere in our central chemoreceptors do we have chemoreceptors set up to measure oxygen content. So what does that mean? Well, essentially it's saying that oxygen does not drive our ventilation process as far as our central chemoreceptors are concerned, which is kind of wild. Again, like I mentioned at the start of this lecture, it's it's kind of backwards to what we intuitively feel is what drives our breathing rate, right? When we're exercising, we typically say like, oh, I'm out of breath. And to us, I think intuitively, a lot of us think, oh, I'm out of oxygen. I need to get more air in so I can get more oxygen. But that's not really not true necessarily. What you're trying to do here is actually try to vent off carbon dioxide so there's less hydrogen protons in your cerebral spinal fluid to shift this equation back to a bit more of a balanced equation. Okay. Again, take home note here, just to paraphrase it one more time in a slightly different way, is our cerebral spinal fluid senses proton differences through chemoreceptors in the medulla and the respiratory control center. We get those hydrogen protons, or we become more acidic there because of carbon dioxide. Okay, not oxygen. It has nothing to do with oxygen. Okay, so that was central, chemoreceptors. What about peripheral, right? I mentioned that there was periphery chemoreceptors as well. We pointed it out on this chart here, right? So here's some peripheral chemoreceptors right there, okay? And so what that looks like is we have two main bodies in which these chemoreceptors are at. So one is our carotid bodies, or carotid arteries, which are in our neck, and the other one is the aortic arch. Okay, so if you recall from our cardiovascular section, it's the main artery coming off the heart. Now, these are both key central hubs if you think about it, because one, the aortic arch goes to the rest of our body, so it's important to have some sort of monitoring system there, and the other goes to our brain. Very, very important to have a monitoring system there. Sure enough, we have chemoreceptors, and what they sense is partial pressure of carbon dioxide, or the amount of carbon dioxide that we have in our blood, dissolved in blood, and hydrogen protons. Let's pause again here. If you notice, nowhere in those chemoreceptors do we have any immediate receptors for levels of oxygen. Interesting. Okay, important to remember. So I think, again, the take home here is carbon dioxide and pH that truly drives our respiratory rate. Okay. We do have some other neural input, as I mentioned before. So stretch receptors in our lungs. We have some in our muscles. We have proprioceptors, which we'll speak to more when we do neuro, in our joints and tendons. So again, we have more cues and drivers of our ventilatory responses from byproducts that typically occur because of exercise. Stretch receptors or mechanoreceptors in muscle and joints and our lungs, generally again associated with an increase of physical activity, increases our respiratory rate. Okay, so again, those should have been a good review. Or just to review what we went over, we have central and periphery chemoreceptors, and our central drivers of ventilation typically are to do with our brain, but also our cerebral spinal fluid. And then peripherally, we have drivers that are carbon dioxide, primarily carbon dioxide and acid, or hydrogen proton concentration, and very few, let's just go back, related to oxygen. Okay, there's some oxygen there, but that's primarily it. So in the carotid body. Okay, but other than that, not anything. And that's important because we need to ensure there's enough oxygen getting to our brain. Okay.